Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. One of the most popular and most beloved Psalms is Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is a psalm that is read oftentimes in public events, particularly funerals, but is one that can be read really at any time and at any moment, and it brings such comfort and reassurance to our souls. And in this psalm, we have a shocking statement, one that really ought to catch us and draw us in. It's in verse 4, where David says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me." What's being described here is the most deepest, darkest, scariest place David could ever go brought no fear to him. He said, even though I get into the darkest things, even to the point of death, the shadow of death, and the deep valley, no matter what I come up against, I fear no evil, he says. How in the world can a person ever get to a point where they fear no evil, even in light of the valley of the shadow of death? This is astounding. Is this even possible? Can a person ever attain to such a life, free of fear? Well, the psalmist said that he had, and he actually shows us how it is that he was able to come about this attitude, have this attitude, and what we find is that when we have or put the same things into place and have the same perspective as the psalmist, as David has, we too can elevate ourselves up to this type of disposition, this type of attitude. Well, how is it that he could walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil? Well, it's that very next statement where he says, "For you are with me." For you are with me. Who is the you that he's talking about? Is he talking about his parents? Is he talking about his friends? Is he talking about maybe some of the soldiers that he knew about from the army? Who was it that he was speaking to that could bring him so much comfort that he would fear no evil, even in the darkest moments? Well, the Lord. The Lord was with him, and it was because the Lord was with him that he was able to have this type of attitude. And it's not just because he had this vague, nominal type of knowledge of God, and that brought him comfort, but he actually knew some very specific things about God, and all of those specific things about God cumulatively worked together to bring David courage and to bring David confidence. For instance, one of the things he knew about the Lord is that the Lord was his shepherd. As he says in the very first verse, "The Lord is my shepherd," which means that David knew that God owned him, that God had ownership of him. God was in control. Because God took ownership of David and had ownership of him, that he also was responsible for David. And who better to be responsible for you than God himself? And so just recognizing the fact that God owns you. You don't own yourself. Other people don't own you. It is ultimately God who owns you. That brings comfort to us. He says, "I shall not want," which shows God's supply. That God was always there for him to supply him with what he needed. Even Jesus talks about God being our supply, that if we seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, all these things would be added to us. That is food and clothing, the basic necessities of life. And what we find is that usually God supplies us with much more than just those basic necessities. But we are promised at least those things. And so God is our supply of physical needs. He's also our supply of spiritual needs. as we place our trust in Him and as we place our trust, of course, in Jesus Christ. But He is our full supply, and when you have a God who is supplying you to the point that you have no want, that's comforting. That is comforting to know. And then he also knew of God's rest. He makes me lie down in green pastures. And this is probably built upon the first two things that he knew about God, because of God's ownership of him, and that God was responsible for him, and that God's supply, because of God's supply and that he had no want, he was able to rest. He was able to lie down and just rest, and knowing that the shepherd was going to take care of him, that the shepherd had everything under control. And so that brought rest, and only God can really, truly give us rest. If we try to rest in anything in this world, it doesn't bring true rest at all, because we know that everything in this world is temporary, and everything in this world is fragile, and cannot really give us the comfort that we need and the rest that we need. We also knew of God's peace. It says that he leads me beside quiet waters, or still waters. And of course the picture there is of this serene environment where all is quiet, all is still, all is peaceful. And a person who is resting in God, resting in God's supply, resting in God's ownership of him, is going to have peace in his heart, and his soul is going to be like those quiet waters, still and calm. But then he also knew of God's refreshment. He says, he restores my soul. He could come to God and be refreshed. When we go out into the world, we find nothing but a wilderness. We find nothing but famine. We might go out to the world thinking that the world will fill us, that the world will satisfy us. But time and time again, we just have to recognize the fact that only the Lord can restore us. Only the Lord can satisfy us. Only the Lord can brighten our eyes again and enliven us. And so, because we have such a God that restores us, that refreshes us, it brings us comfort. He also knew of God's guidance in his life. He says, he guides me in the paths of righteousness. God was guiding him through life. God was his shepherd, and just as a shepherd would guide his sheep to pasture and to still waters, so the Lord was guiding him and leading him, and not just leading him, but leading him in the paths of righteousness, which brings us to the next thing that he recognized about God, and that was God's righteousness, that God had the ability to lead him into a life of righteousness. And this could be a whole devotional on its own, because so many Christians, I think, rely too much on themselves and put too much pressure on themselves to try to attain to righteousness, when time and time again the scriptures show us that God will help us. Even what's called the Lord's Prayer, where he says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's something pray to God, something that we can trust God to do. We could also look in other places that says that no temptation has overtaken us, but God is faithful, who will not allow us to be tempted above what we can bear, but allow a way of escape. God doesn't just call us to a life of righteousness. He helps us in that way, and he guides us in the paths of righteousness. And that brings comfort to our hearts, especially to those who are sensitive to God. And then, of course, we have God's comfort, which is kind of the theme we've been running through all of this, but it's also seen as its own unique point, because as he goes on, after he talks about, I fear no evil, for you are with me, he says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And the rod, perhaps the rod of discipline, when he would get off the beaten track like a sheep wanting to wander, the Lord could use the rod to get him back, to discipline him and get him in the right path. And then the staff to protect him from the enemies, protect him from, if you're sticking with the shepherd analogy, from wolves. But God has a way of both disciplining us, but also protecting us. And of course that brings great comfort. And then lastly, he knew about God's blessings. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Such abundant blessings that God has for us. That God is not ashamed. In front of all of our enemies, He prepares a table of blessings. Our table is full. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3, that He says that He has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. And that is definitely true. So we are filled with the blessings of God. So when we know these things about God, we know of God's ownership, God's supply, God's rest, God's peace, God's refreshment, God's guidance, God's righteousness, God's comfort, and God's blessings. All these wonderful things about God. And we don't just know them intellectually. We don't just have head knowledge about them, but we really believe them and have accepted them into the depths of our heart. We can speak with David and say, I fear no evil, for you are with me. You, my supply. You, my owner. You, my rest, my peace, my refreshment, my guidance, my righteousness, my comfort, and the source of my blessings. You are with me. Therefore, I will not be afraid. Well, I thank you guys for listening in today. I love you guys. Hope you guys have a great day. God bless.